Welcome to a straight to the point video tutorial by the Crimson Stitchery. In this video I'm going to demonstrate the magic loop technique. I'll show you how to do it and then I'll chat about why it's good. This video will go on the How to Knit playlist, which you can find via the Playlists tab here on this YouTube channel for the Crimson Stitchery. Equipment needed. I'm going to be using circular needles in a length that's larger than my desired project circumference. I've gone for a length of 80 centimetres or 32 inches. Demonstration. And I'm just going to be demonstrating a very small circumference for you today. I'll just cast on 24 stitches using the long tail cast on onto one needle end of the circular needles. Here I've got my full amount of stitches cast on, in this case it's 24. I'm going to push my stitches onto the cable and now I'll divide them in half. I've got 24 stitches, so I'm looking for 12. So here I've got the halfway point, 12 stitches on the right, 12 stitches on the left, and I'm just holding it with my finger, pushing the stitches aside, and I'm going to pull the cable through the halfway point. I'm pulling it all the way through, all that excess cable, and then I'm going to push each set of stitches onto each needle. So now my stitches are divided like this. Half on one needle, half on the other needle, with lots of cable from the circular needle excess and slack. Again, if you were casting on many more stitches, your stitches might come onto the cable, but you should still have a little bit of slack to work with. So if I move my ball of yarn, now I've got the working yarn in my right hand here. I'm knitting right-handed, but it's the same principle if you're holding the yarn in your left hand. Now I've got two sets of stitches, but I need to join them in the round. I've got my working yarn in the right hand, and I need to join it to the stitches on the left-hand needle. So I'm pushing the stitches close to the left-hand needle point so that they're ready to go. Keeping the working yarn free, I'm now going to grab my right-hand needle, just the needle, very firmly, and slide it out. Okay, so now I've got a little bit of slack attached to the working needle, and I've still got some slack in the middle of all of the stitches there. This is why you need a longer length circular needle than the amount of stitches that you have, than your circumference. At this point you need to make sure that all of your stitches are not twisted, so this point in the middle is one place they could be twisted. They all need to have their little bums facing each other, like so. Okay, you want to be careful that the bums of the stitches aren't twisted around like that, or you're going to end up with one of those infinity loop tubes instead of just a normal tube of fabric. So now I'm holding the two sets of stitches very close by. I'm going to take my working yarn and I'm going to knit across the left-hand needle. Okay, so we're effectively just going to be joining those two up. I'm taking the working yarn and I'm going to knit into that first stitch on the left-hand needle, and the first stitch is always the hardest. So pull quite firmly with the working yarn here, and with that we have now joined the circle. It's just a matter of knitting across. Okay, now we've got halfway across because I've knitted all of the stitches on my left-hand needle. I can let that fall. Now I need to rotate 90 degrees clockwise, and I'm pulling the cable cord and sliding those unknitted stitches back up to the needle tip. As you can see, it's a little bit stiff because this is the first row. And then I'm pushing out my right hand needle so that I've got the slack. Now I knit across the second half of stitches. And now I'm back to the beginning of the row, and I know that because I've got the tail of yarn there, but you could also insert a stitch marker here if you wanted. So same thing, pull the slack through the left hand stitches and push them back onto the needle. And then I take my right hand needle and I release it so that I can work with it. And then I knit across my second row. I've got to halfway. I pull the left hand stitches back onto the needle, and then I release the working needle in the right hand. I'll just do a row knitting with the yarn held in the left hand so that you understand that it doesn't matter which hand you hold the working yarn in, it's about the transfer of the stitches from left to right. So let's knit across there. Okay, and now I've knit my second row. And you can see here that I'm beginning to build up some fabric in stocking stitch. I've got a couple of rows. Now I'm just going to knit across without talking for a little while. So again, we can see now how we're building up a tube of fabric. And there's the join. And you basically want to always make sure that you've got some slack of the cable of the circular needle on both the right and the left-hand side. So now I've knitted a bit farther, you can actually see what's going on a little bit better. I've got the needles in one hand and the slack of the cable in the other. Here's my lovely little tube. I've gone ahead and tied a knot in the cast-on tail just so that it stops getting in the way a little bit. You can also tuck it away. And as you can see, it's a lovely little round. That's the join there. That's the join there. In essence, what we have is a small circumference of knitting and plenty of slack in the cable on either side. Now I've demonstrated the magic loop technique, I'll run through some common problems and do a bit of troubleshooting, and then I'll highlight some of the benefits of using this technique. But just before I get to troubleshooting, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who supports this channel, whether through a subscription on Patreon or a one-off donation via PayPal. Your contributions help to fund this channel and cover the running costs. This allows me to continue to make helpful content that's freely available to everyone. If you enjoy my videos, please consider donating via Patreon or PayPal. Find links in the description box below. Troubleshooting. If you get confused about what's going on with your yarn management, just look for the end of the working yarn and just very carefully look at which stitch it's going into. That will determine the last stitch that you've worked, so you can just get it out of the way and carry on knitting. Sometimes when you're pulling the cable through, you can accidentally pull it all the way through. So if you need to restart your magic loop, just go back to your last work stitch, fold it in half, get approximately the halfway point and pull it through. Generally, when you work stitches in the round, it's a good idea to put a stitch marker in place to mark your end of row. Here are a few stitch marker options that I'm going to be talking through. We've got some lamp bulb stitch markers, a safety pin and just a ring like that. So a lot of the time when you use stitch markers, you put them onto the needle like so to mark the beginning of the round and you slip it. But as you can see, when you're doing magic loop, if I knit a few stitches, because we've got so much cable slack, the stitch marker tends to just end up dangling around, and when you're pulling your needles through, a lot of the time the stitch marker can just fall off quite easily. So you can see it's just dangling there. So now I've reached the beginning of the round again, you can see my stitch marker is just dangling on the cable, and I have to be quite conscious. See, there it's just fallen off. I have to be quite careful when pulling the needles around the magic loop. So what I prefer to do is to use a lamp bulb stitch marker, and I'll actually insert it into the knitting in between the first two stitches, like so. If you don't have one of these, you could just use an ordinary safety pin. If possible, look for a coilless safety pin so it doesn't have this little loop at the end, and that means that less yarn fibres are likely to get caught into it. If I had done that at the beginning of the project, this stitch marker would have been all the way at the bottom like that. When you're knitting just a few rows, it's quite easy to tell which two stitches it marks the in-between of. But obviously after you've knitted for a little while, you might want to insert another one, just kind of read up the row of stitches and insert it like so. After you've inserted your new one, then remove the old one. So because this is in the fabric, I'll just make sure that it's hanging down so that I don't get my needles stuck into it or anything like that. And now I'm just keeping it out of the way as I knit across the row. Now I've come back to the beginning of the row, you can see my stitch marker is marking the beginning of my row and the end of my row, and again my cable has popped in. That's something that tends to happen frequently, so I can just pull it back through. Benefits. The magic loop technique is perfect for knitting small circumferences, especially things like sleeves and socks, using longer circular needles. So the total length of the circular needle is greater than the circumference of your knitted piece. What this means is that your use of your actual knitting needles can become quite versatile, because if you have circular needles with a longer cord, you can knit large circumferences, small ones like this, and you can knit flat. So that's one reason why magic loop is so popular. Another one is that once you get a hang of the actions of just pulling the end of the needle through, every time that you reach halfway across your circumference, it can make needle management in the round seem more straightforward than when you're using 4 or 5 double-pointed needles, because you only have to deal with 2 halves. And that's the magic loop technique. This video has come to you courtesy of all of my lovely and wonderful channel supporters. If you've enjoyed this video, then please consider making a contribution to the running costs of this YouTube channel via Patreon or PayPal. Find links below. So that's the magic loop technique. And if you are a beginner to this technique, I do suggest that you spend a little bit of time getting used to it, getting to know, how it runs, and just kind of getting accustomed to the feeling of pulling that knitting needle through and kind of manipulating your work around the circular needle cable quite a lot more. So have a little go, and then please do come back once you've kind of got to grips with it, and then drop me a comment and let me know how you found it. But if you are an experienced knitter, or if you're old hat to this technique, please write a comment below and let me know whether or not you prefer the magic loop technique compared to other forms of circular knitting for small circumferences, namely double pointed needles or those tiny little circular needles, which I'm personally not very keen on. As always, I really enjoy hearing your input, and it's always helpful, I know, for other knitters to scroll down into the comments and get a bit of feedback from a wider range of knitters. So thank you in advance. I'm really looking forward to reading your comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button down below and give me a thumbs up. It really helps me in getting this video out into the YouTube algorithm so that more knitters can discover the Crimson Stitchery and all of my video content. Thanks so much for watching, and happy knitting. Bye.